I used to think the scariest thing about my husband was the way his voice could turn cold without warning, like someone sliding a knife across glass. But I was wrong, because the real fear started the night my estranged family called begging for my help, and he stood behind me, listening, silent, smiling, like he'd been waiting for that moment his whole life. And that's when I realized the man I shared a bed with and the people who abandoned me years ago were somehow connected in a way I didn't understand yet, and whatever they were planning involved me, my body, and a choice I might not survive making. I remember the first time I noticed something was off, not wrong enough to scream about, just wrong enough to sit quietly under my skin like a splinter I couldn't reach. It was a Tuesday night, and the kitchen smelled like garlic butter and black pepper from the pasta simmering on the stove, steam fogging the window above the sink. And he walked in with that same soft smile that used to make me feel chosen, the same man who once waited outside my office in the rain just to hand me coffee. And for a second, I relaxed, shoulders loosening, because I wanted to believe the warmth was real, that maybe the tension I'd been feeling lately was just stress or imagination. So I teased him lightly about the cabinet doors he always left open. Nothing sharp, nothing cruel, just a playful comment any couple might make. But his smile didn't fade slowly. It shut off, clean and sudden, like someone flipped a switch, and the air shifted so fast it felt colder against my arms. His jaw tightened, his eyes hardened, and he asked why I always had to criticize him, his voice low and flat. And I froze with the wooden spoon still in my hand because I hadn't meant anything. It was a joke, a normal moment, yet somehow it felt like I'd stepped into a trap I didn't see on the floor. I apologized automatically, the words slipping out before I even understood what I'd done wrong, and he just stared at me for a second longer before turning away like nothing happened, grabbing a glass from the cabinet he'd left open and closing it harder than necessary. And the rest of the night I found myself measuring every word, softening every sentence, laughing quieter, moving carefully, like the whole house had turned into thin ice and I didn't know which step might crack it. And that was when I realized this wasn't the first time I'd done that. I'd been adjusting for months, maybe longer, trimming pieces of myself down to keep the peace, convincing myself this was normal, that all marriages had moods, that love sometimes meant patience. Except patience isn't supposed to feel like fear, and I think a part of me knew that even then, because later that night while I was washing dishes, I felt him step close behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat from his chest through my shirt, and he rested his hand on the counter beside mine, fingers tapping once, twice, slow and deliberate, and he said softly that he didn't like being joked about, especially not by me, and the way he said "by me" made it sound like I belonged to him more than I belonged to myself, and something in my stomach tightened, not panic, not yet, just awareness, like a door inside my mind creaking open, and I remember staring down at the soap bubbles sliding over my hands, thinking I needed to be careful. I just didn't know what I needed to be careful of yet. And if you've ever felt that quiet warning before everything goes wrong, tell me in the comments what your gut said before you understood why. 3 nights later, my phone buzzed across the nightstand while the room was dark except for the thin strip of street light leaking through the curtains, and I almost ignored it because it was past midnight and he hated when anything interrupted our sleep. But the screen kept lighting up again and again until the glow painted the ceiling pale blue, so I slipped out from under the blankets slowly, careful not to wake him, and picked it up, and the number wasn't saved, but the message underneath it made my fingers go cold because it was my mother's name, and for a second I thought it had to be a mistake since she hadn't spoken to me in years, not after the night she told me I wasn't her responsibility anymore and shut the door while I stood outside with a suitcase and nowhere to go. But the message was real, short and urgent, asking me to call as soon as possible because it was about my brother and it was serious. And I just stared at the words while memories pressed in sharp and fast. Birthdays they forgot, calls they never returned, holidays where my chair stayed empty, and my chest felt tight because part of me still wanted their voices to sound like family, even after everything. So I stepped into the hallway and called before I could talk myself out of it, and the line clicked almost instantly like they'd been waiting with the phone in hand. And my mother's voice rushed out thin and breathless, explaining how my brother was sick, how his kidneys were failing, how doctors said he needed a transplant soon. And then she said I was a match, like it was a miracle she deserved credit for. And I waited for something else, an apology maybe, or even just, I missed you. But instead, she asked when I could come, quick and practical, like she was confirming a delivery date. And something inside me shifted quietly because I realized she wasn't calling her daughter, she was calling a solution. And before I could answer, I heard a faint sound behind me, soft but unmistakable, the bedroom floorboard creaking. And when I turned, he was standing there in the doorway, half in shadow, watching me, eyes alert in that calm way he got when something interested him. And he didn't look annoyed or sleepy, he looked focused, like he was listening to every word. And my grip tightened on the phone as my mother kept talking about hospital timelines and paperwork and urgency, her voice blending with the steady sound of his breathing behind me. And I suddenly felt like I was on speaker, even though I wasn't, like the conversation wasn't just mine anymore. And when I finally said I'd think about it, there was a pause on the line, thick with surprise. But the silence behind me felt heavier, because he still hadn't said anything. He was just standing there absorbing it all. And when I hung up, I turned towards him slowly and asked how long he'd been there. And he smiled, small and unreadable, and said, "Long enough." Then he rested his hand lightly on my shoulder, warm and firm, and told me this could be a very important opportunity for us. Not for you, not for your family, for us. And the way he said it made my stomach drop, because I hadn't told him anything about what they wanted, which meant he'd already figured it out. And if you think you know why that smile scared me more than my mother's call, tell me your guess in the comments, because what I discovered next changed everything. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring into the dark while his breathing stayed slow and steady beside me, one arm draped across my waist like a seatbelt I hadn't agreed to wear, and my mind kept replaying his words, important opportunity for us, because they didn't sound surprised or curious. They sounded prepared, like he'd been waiting for a door to open and my family had just unlocked it for him. And by morning, the air in the house felt thick and stale, like before a storm. He moved around the kitchen making coffee, calm, casual, asking what the doctor said, what hospital, what timeline, each question precise, practical, almost businesslike, and I answered carefully, watching him the way you watch a dog you're not sure will bite. And when I asked why he seemed so interested, he just shrugged and said any husband would be concerned. But concern doesn't usually come with that kind of focus, that kind of quiet calculation behind the eyes. And the knot in my chest tightened when he suggested I should call them back and agree to meet right away, because time mattered in medical situations. The way he emphasized time made it sound like a countdown had already started somewhere I couldn't see. So I nodded and said I would think about it. And for a split second, something flickered across his face, irritation maybe, before the soft smile returned. And that was when I knew I wasn't imagining things, because you don't hide expressions unless there's something to hide. And all day I felt him orbiting me, not close enough to touch, just close enough to listen, his footsteps pausing outside rooms, his shadow passing doorways, like he was guarding a conversation that hadn't happened yet. And by afternoon, my phone filled with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. Sweet words, prayers, urgent reminders about how I could save my brother, and every vibration felt louder than it should have in the quiet house, until finally he said gently that it might help everyone if we met them together, that he could come with me for support. And the word support landed wrong, heavy, because support isn't supposed to sound like supervision, and something in me went very still as pieces began sliding into place. The timing of the call, his interest, the way he wasn't shocked, just attentive, and I heard myself ask one simple question: how did they even get my number? And for the first time he hesitated, just a fraction too long before saying maybe they never lost it. But I knew they had, because I changed it years ago after leaving, Only two people had it now, my best friend and him, and my pulse slowed instead of racing because the truth wasn't loud when it arrived. It was quiet, precise, like a lock clicking open, and I smiled back at him the same way he smiled at me, calm, steady, pretending everything was normal. And I said maybe he was right, maybe we should meet them soon, because suddenly I wanted that meeting more than anything, not for my brother, not for them, but to see what would happen when all the people who thought they could use me were sitting in the same room. The room they chose smelled like antiseptic and old air conditioning, and they were already sitting there waiting for me, all of them turning toward me at once like I was the answer to a question they'd agreed on. And I felt his hand settle at the center of my back, guiding me forward, warm, possessive, steady. And I let him because I wanted him close enough to hear everything. So he sat, and I asked my question softly. "How did you get my number?" And the silence that followed tightened the air, my father stiffening, my mother blinking, my brother glancing sideways. And I turned slightly toward him and asked again, "Because you told them, didn't you?" And when he didn't deny it, the truth landed clean and sharp. He'd found them. He'd contacted them. He'd set this in motion, knowing they'd pressure me from one side while he controlled me from the other. And my mother rushed to explain they only wanted what was best, that he cared about my future, that he helped them reach me, like they were all partners in some quiet agreement I'd never signed. And something inside me went very calm as I folded my hands on the table and said, "Thank you for answering my question." And they leaned forward slightly, hope rising. And then I told them I wouldn't be doing the transplant. Not now, not later, not ever. And the silence dropped heavy and stunned, his hand sliding off my back because for the first time, he hadn't predicted my move. And I stood slowly and said they hadn't lost a donor today, they'd lost access, because love isn't something you corner someone into giving. And I walked toward the door feeling their shock behind me like heat. And I thought that was the end of it. I really did, until I remembered one last thing. So I turned back, pulled my phone from my pocket, and pressed play, and his voice filled the room from the recording I'd started days ago, explaining how pressure from blood works better than pressure from a husband. And the color drained from every face while he sat frozen beside his own words. And I slipped the phone back into my bag and smiled softly, because control only works when the other person doesn't see the strings. And tell me honestly, would you have walked away quietly, or would you have pressed play too?